Normally would stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, but unfortunately there's not a flag today. So we'll move into roll call.
Mr. Grigsby. Here. Mrs. McCarthy.
Here.
Mrs. Saxon.
Here.
Mrs. Tamira.
Here.
Mr. Vaca.
Here. Finalization of the agenda.
The agenda is final as presented.
Thank you. It is recommended that the Board of Education approve the written summary of the regular minutes for the meetings on October 3rd, 2022 and October 18th, 2022.
Moved. Second.
Moved by Ms. Tamira, second by Ms. McCarthy. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Tamira.
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy.
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby. Yes. Mrs. Saxon.
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. Superintendent's report. Okay. It is recommended the Board of Education approve the consent agenda resolution as presented.
Second.
By Ms. Tamira, second by Ms. Saxon. Is there any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Tamira.
Yes.
Mrs. Saxon.
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby. Yes. Mrs. McCarthy.
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. All right. Finance audit report, Ms. McCarthy.
I think we have the treasures.
I apologize, I skipped that. I went to it and then we skipped you. Sorry, Michael.
That's okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. How are we doing?
Good.
Great.
Great to be with you all here in Columbus. This is the presentation of the 5-year forecast report. This is our November report, our initial report of the current fiscal year 23. The forecast period starts with the current fiscal year 23 and runs through the end of fiscal year 27. This is an illustration of the actual forecast documents. I realize you probably cannot see those numbers, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what we're talking about. It's 3 years actual data, 5 years projected, and you can see there are many different line items that make up both revenue and expenditures. We always talk about those two areas, but you can see how many different items, just to give you an idea of what makes up the 5-year forecast, and just it puts it in perspective a little bit of the analysis that we do in all the different areas of the district that we look at and take into consideration. The 5-year forecast is basically a roadmap. It's a communication device. It's a planning tool. We use it to drive the decision-making process. It tells us where we currently are and where we are headed. Most importantly, we assess the financial health of the district when we look at the 5-year forecast. This is a requirement under Ohio Revised Code, and we do submit it, we prepare it and submit it twice annually. What I've done here is taken that forecast document and condensed it into a simplified version. So it's a little bit easier to see what the forecast is telling us. We have increasing revenue throughout the forecast period, but we also have increasing expenditures throughout the forecast period. Fiscal year 23, the current fiscal year, we're projecting a surplus of $696,000. And then deficit spending all throughout the forecast period for the remainder of the years. But last year on the 5-year forecast, that deficit is projected to be 6.4 million. So without any additional revenue, the district would need to cut its 2027 projected expenses by 10.23% in order to balance this all out. So just think about that for a minute, 10% of expenses. Now, the effect of that in a growing district like North Ridgeville, that would probably feel like a lot more than 10%. So yeah, that's the forecast overall. When we take the forecast and chart it out, it looks like this. You can see those expenditure blocks where they start to become higher, like elevated over the revenue blocks. And you can see that yellow line representing the cash balance is on the declining all throughout the forecast period. And that is the result of this deficit, these deficit spending. Anytime expenditures are over revenue, it results in a deficit. And that cash balance is absorbing those deficits. And that's why we see this on the decline. So you're seeing an overall worsening financial stability, financial position, financial health in this yellow line, this cash balance line. So why is it happening? Well, if we want to answer those questions, we can start by taking a closer look at revenue itself. This is a makeup of the district's revenue sources. 60% real estate, followed by 24% in state funding. That's not going to change a whole lot through the 5-year forecast. Then we have property tax allocation. That is our homestead and rollback from the state that we get on certain portions of our millage, including the substitute levy. And then you have all other revenues coming in at 6%, like tuition, fees, earnings from investments, any other type of miscellaneous income. Now the line on this chart represents the increasing trend. It's a slow, steady, healthy, increasing trend in revenue over time. And throughout the forecast period, that's going to stay between 50 and 56 million. On average, those increases are projected to be 1.3 million annually through the 5-year forecast. These increases are coming primarily from real estate and increasing total assessed valuation and the projected growth in new construction. Now, new construction has been relatively consistent for the last 5 years, and we have modeled trends that are in line with what those historically have been for us. And then countywide reappraisals, we also have modeled growth in that area as well. So we're factoring all of that in. I did not go as aggressive as this last reappraisal, obviously, but I think we're so far out at this point, if I need to go in and adjust it, I can certainly do that once I have a better idea where it's actually going to come in. But what I've done is kept it consistent with has been historically when it comes to countywide reappraisals. Yep. Changing gears a little bit. Our expenditures, 59% in personnel, staffing, followed by fringe benefits, insurance, retirement contributions, purchase services. Those are our 3 biggest areas when it comes to expenditures on the 5-year forecast. And on average, those increases are projected at 2.7 million each year. Forecast. They're coming primarily from staffing, salaries, benefits in those areas. Those kind of go hand in hand. That's where we see a lot of these increases. You can see the trend line. Now this trend line is between 50 and 62 million. So it's obviously a little bit higher, and the average increase per year is obviously higher. And that's where we see those deficits coming into play. We've also modeled some increased expenditures under our capital outlay line item. We went heavier than we typically would under the assumption that we are going to have to bring in modular units at some point throughout this forecast period. Now, obviously, those numbers could change. They're subject to change depending on what the need looks like. But we have that modeled in as well, and that's contributing to this overall picture. For salaries, I did want to point out, we've been able to, last year, 2 years, we have been able to offset the salary line item. So if you look at the 5-year forecast, you won't see a whole lot of increase for the last year or so. And that is because we've been able to utilize that one-time grant funding that we got for during COVID to offset some of that salary. So you typically see that line item increasing the most. But like I've said it before, it has bought us time. It's bought us time, and it's not a long-term fix. It's not a long-term solution, but it has helped improve the overall financial picture. Actually, I'll wait. I want to show you on a different slide, but the importance of what I'm talking about there. Oh, yeah. There we go. Yeah, so I really like this this chart here because it really tells the story, the overall story. You can see in 2018 where the trend started out there, and where it was headed going into 2019, and then boom, 2020, COVID happened. Revenues down, expenditures down, and then from 2021 to now into projected 2023. They've been overlapping each other. Revenues and expenses have been overlapping each other. We've been able to keep our expenses somewhat very close to the amount of revenue that we are bringing in. And that is because of offsetting those salary amounts with that one-time grant funding. You know, had it not been for COVID and that grant funding, we probably would not have made it this long. And on the 5-year forecast, definitely not in a positive cash balance scenario in each of the 5 projected years. In fiscal year 24, all of that salary is going to come back to the general fund. And that's why you see that elevated starting again in fiscal year 24. And it kind of continues on the same trend, almost like where it was starting here. We had this happen in here, but then it starts to continue along the same trend line. And then here's the same chart, but it's only for the projected years. And you can see how that expenditure line sits above the revenue line for almost the entire forecast period. So although we do have increasing revenue here, the revenue base does not have the capacity to offset these deficits on the horizon, or enrollment growth and the expenses that we are seeing in connection with that, and even the natural rise in inflationary costs throughout the forecast period that you always have to account for. The revenue base does not have the capacity as it is right now to withstand and offset all of that. So when we look at these projected deficits relative to overall revenue, you can see by the 3rd year on the 5-year forecast, fiscal year 25, we're deficit spending by 9.28% of the amount of revenue we bring in. So the amount of the deficit is 9% of our total revenue. And by the time we get to the last year on the 5-year forecast, it's over 10%. So the deficit will have grown to 10% of our total revenue sources. So for the majority of the forecast, then we are in that warning area. That's the light, the pink down here. The red is emergency at the bottom. But for the majority of the forecast, we are in that warning. And that warning is telling us that fiscal stability is suffering and it's on the decline. It is declining over time. And that's primarily because these deficits you're seeing here are being absorbed by the district's cash balance. And that's why you see the cash balance just constantly down, down, down. The higher these deficits become and the more prolonged it is. So when we look at it in terms of cash on hand, operating days, cash on hand, your treasurer here would prefer 90 days. Board policy would also prefer 90 days. As you can see here on the 5-year forecast, or in the third year of the 5-year forecast, in fiscal year 25, we're at 105 days. So we're getting pretty close to that mark by the time we hit the third year. Then the fourth year, we drop below that mark at 73 days. And then by the last year, only 32 days cash on hand. So just to wrap it up here, when this starts to happen, the amount of additional revenue needed or the amount of reductions needed that you have to make, it grows significantly. This is a cycle. And it's oftentimes fixed. It's best fixed when you're early before you let it compound, because this compounds year after year. And then it becomes more and more of a need to try to fix it and make up for that. Most importantly, though, when this happens, it impacts the district, financial aside, but from a planning perspective. I think everybody around this table and here would agree that we are constantly planning. We're planning for next year. We're planning for 2 years from now, depending on what we're talking about. We're always, the district has to be able to plan. And it takes a financial stability to be able to do that and count on, maintaining sufficient revenue sources and cash balances to be able to deliver on all of the expectations of a growing school district. I will leave it at that, but that concludes my report, the November report. The full report will be available on the Treasurer's Office page of the district's website. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions the board may have.
Michael, the revenue stream, you already shared with us that you didn't project aggressively moving forward. Do you anticipate an adjustment in the real estate market? Do you feel confident in those numbers, that those numbers will not go lower than what you're anticipating?
I do. In our case, in our particular case, I do.
So you don't anticipate a large enough adjustment that will affect the floor?
No, what I meant by adjustment is if I had to adjust it, if I was a little too conservative. I'm comfortable with what I have in there. If I had to make an adjustment, it would most likely be to the better. Just because of, we went up, I think it was 19% on this last countywide reappraisal. That's never been the case in North Ridgeville. So that's what I meant. I didn't go too aggressive there and project 19% increases in the forecast, but
I have no concern that the real estate market may make an adjustment to itself that'll impact our forecast.
It could cool off, but I don't think that, again, there's too much new construction. We're adding 20 million in valuation in just new construction alone. I don't anticipate any significant corrections or in affecting our revenue stream there.
And how much did inflation play in your forecast?
It always is a factor. It's always a factor. How much do you mean,
Based on today's current 7% inflation numbers, that really doesn't impact the 5-year forecast. You don't forecast it continuing in that manner?
Not in that particular manner, but I account for it in, when we do projections for, everything ends up costing more. Companies raise their prices. So just inflationary adjustments in the later years of the forecast. But I base it on, for the current fiscal year, kind of where the spending level has been and where it is in this current budget cycle. And I kind of base everything on that and make subtle increases throughout, depending on what we're talking about. Again, like you saw the different line items, there's certain things that, you're going to treat differently than others. For example, gas, utilities, versus, textbooks or something like that. But yeah, we look at all of that and we try to make our best assumption or best guess. where we're gonna land, but it is a working document, very much so, but I'm comfortable in what we have projected here and where we're gonna be on this, so.
Michael, can you remind me of homestead and rollback,
Yes,
what those are?
so that is it's a piece of our revenue stream that we get from the state based on real estate. You meet certain requirements for qualifying for that, and you get it's 2.5% and then 10% homestead and rollback, but that it comes through from the state where they're matching like a certain portion of our millage that we have and our levies that we have. That's why it was so important that we renewed those emergency levies that the district had. There were like 4 separate emergency levies. It was before I got here. We combined them into the substitute. Had that not renewed, we would have lost that piece of homestead and rollback that we were getting, because in 2015, moving forward, they did away with that. But those emergency levies were initially passed before that. So we definitely want to keep those.
Is it the type of community member that qualifies for homestead? and
Yeah, there's
rollback?
certain
Is it-
requirements,
So-
income level,
Okay.
age, there might be a few others.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Finance audit report, Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Rocco. We have 2 items under the finance audit report. First, we have a resolution to approve the financial reports for the month of October 2022. And then we also have a resolution to approve the 5-year forecast for November 2022. And move to approve the finance audit items in 1 reading.
Second. Moved by Ms. McCarthy, second by Mr. Brigsby. Is there any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby,
Yes.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mrs. Tamira,
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. Human Resources report, Ms. Saxon.
We have a few items to consider under the Human Resources Report. 2 support staff resignations, 1 hourly home instructor contract, 3 support staff appointments, 1 support staff substitute appointment, 1 certified staff leave of absence. I move to approve the Human Resources items in 1 reading. Second.
Moved by Ms. Saxon, second by Ms. Tamira. Is there any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mrs. Tamira,
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby,
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. It is recommended that the Board of Education adjourn this regular meeting.
Approved.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Saxon, second by Ms. McCarthy. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby,
Yes.
Mrs. Tamira,
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. Thank you.